So, alliance raids. Notoriously, these 24-man raids run the gambit of being insanely difficult and like herding 23 cats out of the bad red zones on the floor only for the newbie tank to spin the eyeball around so everyone gets swept by the laser. Or so pathetically easy that they had to include a higher eye level requirement so that people would stop stripping their clothes off right before queuing in order to throw themselves naked at Circus Tower. But recently, they introduced a version of the Cloud of Darkness fight on par with most extreme level fights in order to give players a real challenge. And in this video, I'm gonna try to complete this in a No, you're not. What? Yeah, I am. That's what this video's about. Well, you're gonna have to figure something else out because you don't have 23 friends and you are way too afraid to join a random party finder group. What? Shut up! No, I'm not! Okay, then go ahead, join a random party finder group. Ugh, fine, whatever. We'll just use the duty finder and rank the stupid regular alliance raids instead because I'm apparently not good enough to— I used to do the alliance raid roulette pretty often, ever since they first introduced it back in patch 4.1. I've also completed every single alliance raid on release since, like, Heaven's Ward, so I've done most of them quite a lot. By now, most alliance raids are considered old content, and people don't really consider them worth unlocking in a lot of cases. They're all totally optional 24-man party boss rushes, and they can get pretty time-consuming if you get unlucky with duty finder groups. But I really like alliance raids. They're just the right combination of chaos and skill, and running each new alliance raid blind on release is usually a pretty challenging test of how quickly I can revive my friends before I fall off the edge of the platform. Content bloat is a serious problem in Final Fantasy XIV, so it can be hard to determine which of these raids are even worth sinking your time into. But don't worry. I've done most of these raids right when they were released and then for several months and years afterwards, so that makes me incredibly qualified to determine this. Which is the best alliance raid series? To determine this, we'll be judging each raid by 3 categories: story, mechanics, and difficulty. I'll be ranking each alliance raid on a scale of 1 to 10 crystals, and by the end of this video, we'll be able to calculate which of the currently existing 5 alliance raids is the best alliance raid, by which raid scores the highest at the end of the video. Oh, and I won't be including the Dawntrail alliance raids in this, not because I hate Final Fantasy XI, because I do hate Final Fantasy XI, but because it's not complete yet, so it isn't really fair to judge it. Let's start off with the very first alliance raid released, the Crystal Tower raids. Back when I first started playing, you had to wait upwards of an hour or even more in queues to do these raids at all. Now, they're required by the story thanks to Shadowbringers, and the alliance raid roulette exists, so these raids are still pretty commonly done. If you're past ARR, you've definitely done these raids and been introduced to everyone's favorite Catboy. So, I'll rank the story first. I think the story for the Crystal Tower raids is a very solid 8 out of 10. Shadowbringers is my favorite expansion, and I think these raids are a pretty good lead up to it. It introduces a lot of lore that the story built on later, like the Allegan Dynasty and the Void Shard. You also get to hang out with Cid and Nero, who are always good additions to any story, and the ending is actually a pretty emotional climax if you found yourself attached to a certain red Catboy. It's a really good lead up to the masterpiece that is Shadowbringers. However, it is pretty annoying to run around and collect all the crystals, and yoRHa is kind of a little bitch about it the whole time. As for the mechanics, it's a 4 out of 10. There's nothing all that annoying or too terrible to figure out, and it's the first time a lot of commonly used mechanics are introduced to the player, so it's actually good that they're straightforward. There's nothing that really stands out though, since most of these mechanics are pretty standardized at this point. However, for difficulty, well, it's pretty difficult to stay awake. It's a 2 out of 10 for difficulty, but I mean, it's not a 0. If you get a lot of sprouts or trolls, it might take you a while to convince Alliance C to stay on the pad or to send the right group into Cerberus's belly, but there's nothing really all that difficult to figure out. There are also a couple instant death mechanics, so ol' Zandy can sometimes catch you while you're napping. Or your friends can rescue you out of the AoE and you can get caught by his fists. Overall, the Crystal Tower is mostly carried by its importance later in the story, and so it gets a total of 14 crystals out of 30. Not off to a great start, but it's the first Alliance raid they made, so we can kind of give it a little bit of leeway. The Shadow of mhach is the next raid series released with the Heavensward expansion. And I'll start off by saying that I think the aesthetics of these raids is one of the best. But I might just be saying that because my favorite color is purple. It has a whimsical mix of dark and spooky aesthetics that make it enjoyable to walk around and take in the sights. The story is also one of the more interesting ones, and it doesn't overstay its welcome. It's a pretty engaging tale of sky pirates and the ancient city of mhach, where they accidentally the void and you have to stop Final Fantasy Satan from reopening the door to hell. The characters are fun and the story is entertaining, which is more than can be said for...
They ask you how you are, you just have to say that you're fine.
So I give the story an 8 out of 10. It's pretty good. As for the mechanics, Void Ark is a bit of a snooze fest, but both the Weeping City of mhach and Dune Scathe have some pretty standout boss fights and killer aesthetics. None of the mechanics are really all that complicated, but they're interesting and can be fun to figure out on your first run. Ozma is an extremely fun fight with unique mechanics that I never get tired of, even when I was regularly wiping on this raid when it first came out. The final fight of this raid also manages to be cool, dramatic, and very flashy, even if it's not all that difficult. So for mechanics, I'll give the Shadow of mhach a 9 out of 10. But for difficulty, it gets a 6. Most of the fights aren't very hard, and there aren't a lot of mechanics that will instantly kill you if you screw them up, but it's a comfortable level of difficulty that was pretty punishing on release. And it can definitely still trip up new players trying it out for the first time. But you can kind of just breeze through Void Ark even faster than Circus Tower, and it's basically impossible to die during it, so that kind of brings the whole raid series down in difficulty. But overall, the Shadow of mhach raids get a 23 out of 30. It's a very solid raid series, and I think it's some of Final Fantasy XIV's better side content. I also think it's a really underrated Alliance raid, and has some pretty cool lore drops along the way, so I definitely think they're worth doing. But is Shadow of mhach the best Alliance raid series? Well, we still have 3 others to go, so let's continue. Return to Ivalice is the 3rd series of 24-man Alliance raids, and the raid released in the Stormblood expansion. It's also the first Alliance raid series to rely very, very heavily on my favorite crutch that Final Fantasy XIV uses: references! But even if it wasn't depending super heavily on you playing Final Fantasy Tactics to be engaged in the story and to understand half the concepts that it tries to throw at you, the cutscenes between each Ivalice raid are so long. It's like they play an entire full-length movie for each cutscene, and while it does introduce some cool concepts, like the pretty unique-looking ruined steampunk city and structures, along with the Garlean theater troupe, it's just not interesting. The Ivalice story is so dull, especially if you don't care about Final Fantasy Tactics or Final Fantasy XII. It's very up its own ass, and it didn't do a good job of making me interested in playing Final Fantasy Tactics either. I can't point at things and go, oh, I remember that. So to me, it's just an endless amount of dialogue that I lost interest in almost immediately. Even the boss fights are basically all designed like this, where it's a character that I don't really recognize or know testing me, and then they all fly out at the end to protect me, and I just don't care. It throws way too much at the player at once and relies super heavily on you already being familiar with the world and the concepts of Final Fantasy Tactics to stay interested. And if you're a fan of that game, you'll probably rate it a lot higher than me, but to me, it's a 1 out of 10. Which is actually kind of a shame, because I think the Ivalice raids have some pretty cool and unique mechanics. They were definitely trying to come up with stuff they haven't done before in these raids, and it shows. I actually really love the math section of the fight because it makes you have to stop and think, and you also get to see who in your party is really bad at math. And even the Thunder God fight is still a pretty fun fight, and I like the tether mechanic because it does require each member of the party to do something and take charge. There are a lot of creative mechanics that they use in these raids to make it interesting and easy to pay attention to, even if some of the boss fights can be pretty long and tedious. So I rate the mechanics a pretty solid 8 out of 10. And for difficulty, I'm actually going to give it a 7 out of 10. When these raids first came out, they were tough. Like, tough in all caps. However, while I do think they're fun and definitely difficult, a lot of the mechanics aren't really very intuitive and can get very frustrating. If you're new to these raids, you'll definitely die a lot, and probably not realize why, because the difficulty of these raids comes mostly from them throwing everything in the book at you at once. A lot of the difficulty is also a little bit artificial, because it comes from the fact that you're sent back to level 70 and you don't have nearly as many tools as you do in higher level content. Healers especially suffer from this, because the party is going to be dying a lot, and you're going to need to constantly heal them without the convenience of, say, placing down Liturgy of the Bell and letting it heal the party through every raid ride. But content-wise, the ivalice raids are a true test of your reflexes, and while I personally didn't really like the story, it's been years since they came out, and I still don't fall asleep while playing through the content, so that counts for something. 16 out of 30. Now, here is where I have a confession to make. I really like Nier Automata. Yes, that's right. Final Fantasy XIV finally decided to reference a game that I genuinely love and enjoy. Nier Automata is a perfect game, and everyone should go play it. So now that Final Fantasy XIV is referencing something I like, I'm gonna love it unconditionally, right? I'm gonna get to point at stuff and be like, oh, I remember this. Well, no. Because, you see, the yoRHa Dark Apocalypse story is bad. Awful. It's terrible. There isn't a single good thing that I can say about this story. It disappointed me in every single imaginable way, and I think most people are in agreement about this. I hate the dwarves, I hate their stupid festival, and I hate the fact that they barely even included any of the Nier Automata characters or incorporated any of the lore implications further into the game, and I hate most of all that 2B carried 9S away and they faded to a black screen instead of showing even a still shot of this, and then they walked off screen and were never heard from again. It's a 2 out of 10 purely because it is in Final Fantasy Tactics, and I can also give it a tiny single point of leeway because the pandemic hit right after Copied Factory was released. I do think the story definitely suffered very, very hard because of that, and it shows, which sucks. The raids themselves, though? The Nier raid mechanics are an absolute 10 out of 10. They are so much fun. I love these raids and I will gladly run them over and over again, which I've done to collect the gear and all the minions because the gear is by far some of the best in the game. The aesthetic of these raids in general is so cool and so unique, borrowing from Nier's aesthetics to create some incredible boss arenas and hallways to walk through. The bosses themselves not only have incredible designs, but they're really fun to fight, with mechanics that usually keep the entire party engaged while requiring you to be very aware of your surroundings. They're all pretty long raids, but I've never really felt it while running them because each boss is unique enough to keep you paying attention through the entire fight. Not to mention, sometimes they release the balls during the ad phase hallways, so you and your friends can play Vuln Stack Olympics to see who can get the most stacks of vulnerability without dying. For difficulty, they get an 8. I think the Nier raids are actually really well balanced when it comes to difficulty level, because while I did nearly reach Lockout while running Puppet's Bunker for the first time, over time they got gradually easier and faster as players learned how each new mechanic worked, and that's exactly how I think an Alliance raid should be. Challenging, but still something that you can learn to perfect. So overall, yoRHa Dark Apocalypse gets a 20 out of 30. Just remember to skip the story and you'll probably have a great time running through them. For the last complete Alliance raid series, we have the Endwalker raids, Myths of the Realm. When it was first announced, I thought this series had a lot of potential and actually seemed like a really cool idea to base a raid around. The 12 were an important part of the early game, but haven't really been mentioned at all since then, so it felt a lot like what Endwalker was trying to do in terms of tying up loose ends. And while going around with the little gods, I actually felt a lot of nostalgia, and it did manage to tug at my heartstrings a little bit. But I can't rate this story higher than a 4 out of 10. There's a lot of potential here that just feels totally wasted in the end. To boil down the gods of Eorzea, who are so important that you have to select one to be your patron god when you make a new character, to just one of the ancients that followed Vana is just a little anticlimactic. Personally, I think the gods of yoRHa should have been used for something bigger and more expansive. Like, I actually think they probably could have based an entire expansion around exploring the gods of yoRHa and where they came from. If they were otherworldly beings, or even from other planets like the dragons, or even something just a little more interesting than the patron god of my character is fire-aspected Jim from accounting. As for the mechanics, I can't really give it higher than a 6. None of the mechanics of this raid really do anything new or unique, and it feels a lot like they mostly repurposed mechanics from other raids rather than coming up with anything new. The raid relies very, very heavily on cleaves with a tell on the floor that shows up very quickly and then disappears. This mechanic is pretty consistent through the entire raid series, and it's extremely easy to learn. So for difficulty, it gets a 4. It's still difficult enough that people will probably die, but these raids are easy enough that even on the first week these raids came out, I can't remember wiping a single time, except to the final mechanic of the first one, which was actually really, really cool, but you can just kind of skip it now. To me, I actually found these raids pretty boring after doing them the first time. There's no real challenge, I didn't like the lore drops, so overall, I just thought these raids were kind of disappointing. Myths of the Realm gets a total of 14 out of 30. And now we can finally calculate our winner. Now, obviously, the best alliance raid is subjective, to everyone's own individual tastes, and this ranking is just based off of mine. Which is objectively correct, but you know. I'd love to hear which is your favorite alliance raid and why you like it, so post a comment below and let me know. I will gladly fight you about it. And now, without further ado, the best alliance raid in all of Final Fantasy is the Shadow of mhach with a score of 23 out of 30. Everyone go play the Void Arc raids right now so that you too can learn the joys of Sky Pirates and Evil Woman Ass. After running through every single raid again for the sake of this video, I can still definitively say that alliance raids are probably some of my favorite content in the game. I do truly love the chaos of it all, and nothing is better than a blind run of the most recent alliance raid on release. I'm tentatively looking forward to where the next alliance raid series is going to go, even if I'm not exactly excited about how much they're leaning on their Final Fantasy XI references. Thanks for watching! Remember to like and subscribe because I really appreciate it a lot. Okay, bye!